Hey everybody. So we are going to continue to focus on shape, and this time your challenge will be to create a sculpture with 3D shapes using reused or recycled materials to help celebrate Earth Day, be kind to our planet. And when we do this, we are going to be looking at freestanding sculpture, which would be a sculpture, a 3D form that you can see the front, the back, the side, the other side, and depending on how tall it is, possibly the top of it. If it is floating above your head, you could possibly see the bottom of it. And we are going to experiment with relief sculpture, which would be attached to a wall here, and part of it would come off the wall. So you would see the front of it, but you could also see the side and the side, but you wouldn't be able to see the back. So we're going to experiment with those. And then at the end, this is going to be hopefully pretty fun for you. We're going to experiment with scale, because you're going to build your sculpture, but then you're going to add a couple elements to it when you take your photograph of it to alter its size, or how its size appears to us, the viewer, when we look at your photograph, right? So after you watch the video, think about the materials that you're going to need for it. You want to collect those, all right? And then you'll create your sculpture, add the elements, the surprise elements at the end, right, to alter the scale. Take your photograph, and then make sure you add it to either Seesaw or Google Classroom so I could see it, right? So check out the how-to videos. We are going to experiment with a little bit of glue, a little bit of tape, and a little bit of nothing at all to put your sculptures together. So check it out. Make sure you share your work so I can see it. Okay. So the first thing that you want to do is gather materials that you could use for this reused material sculpture. So I've got some cardboard boxes, I have some breakfast bar boxes, some cardstock there, that's not really reused. I've got some toilet paper rolls, masking tape, scissors. What you don't see in the photograph here is some Scotch tape and a glue stick. So I've collected some materials to use possibly for my sculpture. I'm not going to use everything. I'm not going to use those little Easter egg plastic things over there. I'm going to save them for an experiment next week. But you want to gather your materials first. So once you do have those materials, then you want to start to cut them up into some smaller shapes. You can make everything the same if you want. I like to have some variety. So I've got some longer, skinnier rectangles there. I've got a skinny rectangle. I've got some larger squares and smaller squares, a couple medium-sized rectangles. As you're cutting, if you find cardboard, if you're using that too difficult, you may want to see if you can have a family member maybe help you make some cuts, or look for thinner materials like cereal boxes or boxes like that. Are a little thinner and they're a little easier to cut, and they work just as well. So you can see I've altered some of my shapes even more. I've made a semicircle right there. If you're looking up in the upper left-hand corner, I've kind of made like a bubble bee shape. If you're using cardboard like I am from this Amazon box, you can see how you can peel one layer of it up and it gives you a different texture. You don't have to do this, but it can add an interesting element to your sculpture. Then what you want to do, if you don't want to have to rely on glue at all for your sculpture, what you can do is make slits on various sides of the cardboard shapes that you've made, or the paper shapes that you've made. So you can see the circle there. I've got three here on this rectangle, and we are going to use those to put the sculpture together. So once you have pieces of the board cut, then you could slide them together where one cut is going to meet the other, right? So they are intersecting. One is horizontal and one is vertical. And the cool thing about not using glue is that if you don't like it, then you simply pull it apart and you try it again. So it offers you a lot of flexibility in your design. It doesn't get frustrating right away because it's very easy to take apart and start over. So here are those same two pieces from a different angle. So one of the interesting things about sculpture is that depending on how you look at it, if you look at it from the front, it's going to look different than from the side. If you look at it from the top, it's going to look different from there. So a sculptor needs to think about what their artwork looks like from different angles as people walk around it. A painter or a photographer does not have this challenge to think about. So as you do your sculpture, as you build it, take the time to look at it from different directions to see how it looks. Is it interesting from the front? Is it interesting from the side? So I've added a few more pieces to my design. You can see that piece that I peeled that has that bumpy texture. I've created kind of an arch and attached it. So as you build, what you can also do is add more slits to pieces. If I need a piece to connect somewhere, I'm going to have to add a cut possibly to make it work. So same sculpture, all I've done is rotated it. And here I've rotated that sculpture one more time. And what another challenge a sculptor has versus a painter or somebody who's making a chalk pastel drawing is that if they are making a freestanding sculpture, they better make sure it can stand. If you're making a large sculpture and people are walking around it, you don't want it to fall on other people. So as you work, if your sculpture is off balance and it tips over, that's a challenge for you. How do you need to adjust it to make sure it's going to stand up as you add pieces? If this were to fall over, maybe I lay it down on its side and I work from it for that way, and it would still be a freestanding sculpture. So here is one of those toilet paper rolls that I had, and you can add this to your sculpture as well. So I'm going to cut this toilet paper roll, this board, and it's a little thinner, it should be a little easier to cut, into a couple smaller shapes. So when I cut it into smaller shapes, I rounded off a couple edges, I put slits on it, and where that piece at the top goes onto the Amazon box that I already had, I had to put another slit on that box part, that vertical piece, so they would slide together correctly. So we have built a freestanding sculpture, and if you don't like it, take it apart and try it again. Come up with something new. Again, that's the cool thing about this. I have a center like this in my classroom, and the pieces are already pre-cut. Some of you are familiar with it, where you can come over there when you're done your work and experiment with different cardboard sculptures. What I've done here is I've taken some masking tape, made a couple loops of it, and I've put it on the back and attached it to my wall. So now that freestanding sculpture becomes a relief sculpture because I can't see the back. So when we are looking at it, I can see it from the front. I can see it from an angle. I can look at it from this side or the other side, and again, the sculpture is going to look different. One of the neat things too about making sculptures like this is the shadows become a really interesting element, because then you have dark areas on your sculptures, you have light areas, you have medium areas, and it adds different levels of interest that you might not have realized as you were building it. If the light is coming in from a window, it makes it kind of dramatic. So after I built that sculpture, I took it off the wall, took the pieces apart, and I used some of them in a couple new pieces to create a second sculpture. Right? So I was trying out multiple ideas, and I encourage you to do the same thing, because if you like it and you take it apart and then you build something else, then you realize, I like the first one better, it's very easy to go back and try it again. one more shot of this sculpture just so that you can see, again, if you look at it from a different direction, the sculpture is going to look a lot different. Okay, so similar materials. I've still got my toilet paper roll and my cardboard, but this time I'm going to use a little masking tape to secure, to add a couple pieces as well. So this one uses adhesive as well as the slits to construct the sculpture. For this sculpture, I wanted that semicircle cylinder, that cylinder, half cylinder shape, there we go, to attach to that flat piece of cardboard. So you can see what I'm doing is I tore a piece of the masking tape and I put half of it inside the cylinder and half of it is hanging loose. So when I place it down on the flat piece of cardboard, what I can do is I attach that second half to that cardboard base and I put my finger in there to kind of smooth it out to make sure it sticks together. Then I can lift up that half cylinder, add another piece of tape just like I did the first time, and lay it down and smooth it out again. So that way that half cylinder is going to stay on that flat surface. It would be very tricky to kind of try and glue that down because the edges of the cylinder are so skinny. If you have glue sticks available, you can also use glue. It could be Elmer's glue or it could be a glue stick like this to add details to your reusable object material sculpture as well. I have a long rectangular strip that I cut. I'm adding glue to that side, that edge there, so I can attach it to my sculpture that way. So you can see here, I am adding that rectangular piece on top of the cylinder. And if I'm adding it to like a 3D piece that's popping up, you can also see that my thumb is pressing that rectangle down, but then my pointer finger is on the inside supporting the cylinder so I don't crush it, right? So I'm applying pressure in two different directions to make sure it sticks. This isn't necessarily permanent, but it will last for your sculpture. Here's another angle of me applying pressure in both directions. Another method you can use for your sculptures is if you tear a piece of tape. You saw how I hinged the half cylinder on. Well, I can take a piece of tape like this, make a loop of tape on the back of a shape that I want to add to the sculpture, and press it on. And I don't actually have a photograph of that particular thing. The circle is behind the long rectangle that I'm holding right there. So with this long rectangle, just another sculptural technique for you, is you can take a shape like that and you can bend it before you add it to your sculpture. So that way you can play with curves that you make as well as curves of the toilet paper tube or curves that you've cut. So I added a couple more pieces to that sculpture and felt like it was interesting. Here's what that freestanding sculpture right now looks like. Then what I did in order to turn it into a relief sculpture is I made a couple loops of tape, placed those loops of tape on the back of the sculpture, and used those pieces of tape to hold the sculpture to the wall while I took my photographs. So here you can see what that relief sculpture looks like from an and what it looks like from a slightly different angle. So if cardboard is a little too hard for you to cut, this is an example, similar process where I have used thinner board delivery box, right? But it could be a cereal box, breakfast bar, anything like that that's a little thinner and easier for you to cut. So I'm going to take this material and cut it into some shapes. Here you can see where I've cut out a circle. I've kept one of the rectangular sides, made some triangular shapes right there. And you can see where on that rectangle at the top where it has the tabs from where the box closed, I'm going to keep those because I can use them to help me build my sculpture. With this sculpture, since it's a little bit thinner, easier to use, I can use the cut slit method. I can use masking tape, or since this is white and if I don't want the tape to show, I can use Scotch tape to hold pieces together. Here I have added Scotch tape over a folded edge of this piece, so I can then attach that semicircular piece to the rectangle at the bottom there. So all I did is folded that tab and placed the Scotch tape right over it, so it's on the tab and it's also on the rectangle underneath it. Here's that same shape from a different angle, just so you could see it in a different light. Here I've made another small piece. I bent the paper similar to what I did with the cardboard before to make a curve. I folded one edge over to make that tab, and then I've put the tape half on the tab and half free. And I was able to then create that loop that you see down there off of the short side of the paper sculpture there. So I have a piece of Scotch tape holding one tab and the other tab where the two semicircle edges connect to that base. You can simply cut two lines on your paper sculpture, and you can bend that back in a different direction to add a sculptural element as well. Here you can see where I have taken a long skinny piece, kind of rolled it in on my finger. You can do this with a pencil or a marker to give yourself kind of like a long curve or a spiral shape. So here is that spiral shape in action. So I kind of loosened it up a little bit, and then I put a piece of tape over the end of it so I could secure it to the base. I continued to add a couple more pieces, and since this material was a little thinner, I went in and cut out some extra pieces from that base there. You could kind of see that zigzag at the bottom, the big curve that I cut out. So a thinner material is going to add, it's going to allow you to add a little bit more detail if you want to subtract parts from it. And it started as a freestanding sculpture on my table. And then again, I used tape, just like I did the cardboard sculpture, and attached it to my wall temporarily so I could take a photograph of it. So now we have a relief sculpture here. And you could see, especially on this one, if you're using just one color material like cardboard, especially white, you could see how the light creates the shadows on the sculpture and on the wall that the sculpture is on. It adds a definite, interesting element, and you can be really playful with that. Once you have your sculpture built, you've got your 3D shape, either relief or freestanding, or both. Here's where the added scale element comes in, because right now your sculpture is rather small in scale unless you chose some really big materials to work with, but it's probably about the size of a shoebox or a little smaller, right? Let's size a remote control, something like that. But now what I'd like you to do is see if you can find some figures. It could be a stuffed animal, it could be an action figure, it could be a Lego minifigure, and I'd like you to have those objects act as viewers for your sculpture. You want them to engage with the artwork that you made. And what this is going to do is it's going to make the sculpture appear that it is much larger than it is in actuality, as it is right now. For example, we have a lot of Star Wars action figures in our house, and I chose, I can't remember if that is Ki Jin, I think who that is, and Chewbacca, and I took my sculpture outside, my freestanding sculpture, and I placed it in the grass. It could be on the ground, anywhere. It could be on your floor, wherever you want to set it up. And then position the figures in a way that makes it look like they are looking at the artwork, or they're talking about it. They're engaged in some way. And you can be really creative with this. You can have fun with it. Humor in artwork is totally okay. And then you want to take a photograph of it where you're really just focusing on your sculpture and the figures. If there's anything else that is like in the photograph when you take it before you snap the picture, just try and zoom in enough so you get rid of that other stuff, and you can always edit and crop afterwards. So this is one example. Here's another example. So for this one, I taped my sculpture up to the bathroom wall. And on the little table that we have in there, I positioned a gonk droid so it looked like it was looking up at the sculpture. So again, now the sculpture looks a lot bigger than it really is because of the size, the scale of the gonk droid. And here's that same combination of sculpture and gonk droid. And I retook the photograph because in the previous image, you see like the corner of the table. And I felt like that made it not as believable. So I took another photograph without that corner showing in the front. So now it looks like, the gonk droid is walking in an art museum or a gallery and is looking up at the piece. We also have some Lego Friends characters around the house. So I took a few of those and set up this sculpture outside. You can see one of the characters is just walking by the sculpture. The other two characters are over there talking about the negative and positive shapes in this dynamic freestanding sculpture. And then I took that same sculpture, put tape on the back, and taped it to a garden planter. So now it looks like my Lego friends are discussing this relief sculpture in the sculpture garden that they are visiting. And there you have it. So I cannot wait to see what you do with this shape, sculpture, and scale experiment. Please take your time, have fun, try out multiple options, and make sure you share your work correctly to either Seesaw or Google Classroom. Shine bright.